George Orwell famously said, "Whoever controls the past controls the present." And what the Kremlin have been doing since President Putin came to power is rigorously enforcing a new history of the Stalin era.
I want to start by talking about President Putin's rehabilitation of Joseph Stalin, the brutal dictator in Russia. Recently, we have seen a new statue of Stalin actually in a Moscow train station. How do you view this sort of revisionism of Stalin's legacy?
And I think it's all part of a pattern that's been going on under President Putin for the best part of 20 years. George Orwell famously said, "Whoever controls the past controls the present." And what the Kremlin have been doing since President Putin came to power is rigorously enforcing a new history of the Stalin era. That manifests in many ways, but I think it all really stems from President Putin's desire to hold on to and to build his power and to create his reputation as the new great Russian Tsar. And in the process, it's important for him that he identifies with the last powerful leader they had, Stalin, erases the difficult and really unpleasant things about the crimes against humanity that Stalin committed, and instead focuses on his great win over Nazi Germany and his building for the first time of the Soviet Union as an industrial economy.
Russia has not really got a history as a democracy in the sense that we in Britain and America and other Western countries have had. They had this chaotic period in the 1990s, which is remembered in Russia as a time of economic hardship and political chaos. So do you think that this rehabilitation of Stalin fits in with Russian history, Russian culture, that Russia is a country that is used to and supportive of generally authoritarian leaders?
Well, there has certainly been a very sad history for the ordinary Russian people over many decades, indeed hundreds of years. We need to remember that the slavery went on, serfdom went on in Russia until the mid 19th century. And the serfs, the slaves who were bound to their master's land, were only released at that point. So there isn't really a history in any way of democracy in the way that we have it in the West. And Russia was ripe by the end of the 19th century for all sorts of extremism to come into play. And, we eventually saw that with the Russian Revolution, which was then ruthlessly enforced by Lenin first and then Stalin after him. And that set the course right the way through until eventually that great experiment ran out of steam and was shown to be pretty empty in terms of its promises of utopia, heaven on earth, which was Marx's phrase about what he said communism would bring. And so they ended up, as you say, with this terrible situation in the 1990s. And there's a strong part of the Russian psyche today which just longs to go back to a rosy tinted image, which is not really the reality, but a rosy tinted image of what life was like under communism when employment was assured. There were vast food queues, huge shortages. You couldn't get all sorts of goods. If you wanted to order some luxury goods, they used to joke you had to wait 7 or 8 years for their delivery and just make sure that the plumber wasn't coming on the same day. There's we all like to look back upon the years of our childhood, those of us who were old or those in Russia who were old enough then to look back and think that everything was rosy then. It wasn't. But it's so difficult for so many people still today, and was in the 90s. They actually want peace. But at the same time, there is this peculiar thing within the Russian psyche, and you see it on Russian television, on the TV station, which is totally controlled now, the TV stations. You see these constant refrains that they don't necessarily want Russia to be loved or honored. They want it to be respected. They want Russia to be feared. That somehow or other There's a pride element, a wounded pride element of what they went through in the 1990s. And Putin, through various reasons that I can go through, has exerted complete control over the whole country and every aspect of media. Um, and that's reinforcing the idea that there is indeed some kind of glorious future to come.
Now, President Putin has a complicated and quite nuanced set of views on Stalin, or at least he has expressed these views over the years. It isn't just this was a great man who is fantastic and I support his legacy 100%. He has been critical in some ways. And he actually has compared Stalin to, he did this about, I think, 15 years ago. He was talking about the statue of Oliver Cromwell outside of the British Parliament, and he compared Stalin to that statue, basically saying that he was a man of historical importance, but we don't necessarily support everything that he did. Do you think that's an apt comparison with Oliver Cromwell, obviously still a controversial figure in British politics and British history, and as Putin said, there is a great big statue of him right outside of Parliament?
Well, I think interesting enough, you say that was 15 years ago. And I think when Putin was beginning to establish his power base, it was the Stalin era was undeniable. Um, and you couldn't really avoid it. So he needed to be able to distance himself from it. But remember, he's a KGB man. Once a KGB man, always one for life. The secret police were the secret police who served Stalin, and he is a member of the Inheritor organization. And the Cromwell parallel is interesting, but it falls apart pretty quickly. Um, the degree of control that Putin has exerted over the country, gradually, bit by bit, his coming to power was immensely controversial. It was all these explosions that took place in Russian apartment blocks, which were blamed on the Chechens until someone actually managed to find the explosive under one which hadn't gone off. And then when the local police started to investigate, all of a sudden the secret police turned up and took it all and said, "Oh no, it was only a practice exercise," and basically it was not. And those who exposed that, like Alexander Litvinenko in England and others in Russia, were all assassinated to quieten them down. And since then, the Cromwell comparison, um, every opportunity to, shall we say, to try and make him into a Cromwell has been rigorously enforced. Every single organization that was set up to commemorate the Gulag years, Memorial particularly, to keep all the records, to keep the memory alive of what these millions of people had suffered. I mean, I'll go into the figures in a minute, but it's really important to remember those figures. Um, Memorial was shut down, their offices raided, their records and their archives, really important archives, confiscated, but they managed to smuggle them abroad in the end, totally shut down, accused of being a foreign agent, one organization after another. Shut down or taken over, TV stations taken over, radio stations taken over, journalists either intimidated into silence or arrested, imprisoned, or assassinated. We just reached the anniversary many years ago of the assassination of Anna Politkovskaya, who was one of the brave early journalists who was exposing what was going on in terms of the murder which was being ordered by the Kremlin. And she was got rid of, and Alexander Nemtsov more recently. There's one figure after another where this has happened to. And social media in Russia is now rigorously enforced. They have their own version of Facebook. You're not allowed to post on Facebook or Instagram. People may do. They may, a blind eye may be turned to it. But social media now rigorously controlled. And if you post the wrong thing on it, you could get into big trouble. There was a man who just posted a sympathetic view of Ukraine from somewhere in the Urals region, I think, in Russia fairly recently, and he was arrested and he's been sentenced to years in prison. This is the life that anyone who objects to the regime in Russia now lives.
So you said you were going to talk about some statistics. Now, I will quote, maybe it's apocryphal, you can tell me perhaps if it is or not, but it's this quote from Stalin that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And I think you should go through perhaps Stalin's real legacy and perhaps describe to people who don't know the history completely who this man was, what he did, and contextualize the fact that they've just put a statue up of this brutal, brutal dictator in a Moscow underground station.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I keep a little note of the figures beside me because there's so many. But in a brief summary, what we've got is we've got a prison system that operated right across Russia with maybe 1,000 different prison camps over the course of time. Maybe 18 million people passed through those labor camps. A further 10 million people were taken from their homes at very short notice, often put onto cattle cars and transported maybe hundreds or thousands of miles away and dumped in the middle of the desert wastes in Kazakhstan or up in the high northern forests of northwest Russia because they were considered to be a threat to the state and not allowed to go back. And the casualties in those deportations alone were huge. I mean, of the 6 million people or so who were deported, not arrested, but just deported and kept under military escort, you probably got something like 900,000 to a million who never survived as a result of that. And as far as the Gulag itself is concerned, that's the name of this prison system which Lenin started up, not Stalin. And people admire Lenin today and say he was different from Stalin, but he only set the foundations of what Stalin was later to follow on with. As far as the Gulag system is concerned, there was the best part of 18 million people who passed through these camps. And of those, of the total 28 million who were arrested or kept under military escort when they were deported or whatever, something like 2.75 million to 3 million or so died. And in one 18-month period, the worst one of all, the Great Terror of 1937 to 38, the secret police shot over 670,000 people in 1 year. 18 months, rather. They shot 670,000 people in 18 months. The same number were taken off to the camps. Now, Stalin may say 1 million is a statistic. And in some degree, he's almost right, because we can't compute what 670,000 dead bodies in 18 months looks like. There's an interesting thing I put in my latest book, which is a brief overview of this, because most people don't have the time to read 3 volumes of Stalin's Gulag Archipelago, which they should do, but today they won't. I produced last year a small little book, which is available on Amazon, called At Dawn They Came, and that summarizes the whole history from the Lenin Revolution of 1917 through to Stalin's death, which gives all these figures and some stories and whatever else. But I put in that a photograph of the Washington Memorial, and I don't know if I can raise that up on screen, Stephen, but I put a picture of that, of the Washington COVID Memorial. And if I just step back a little bit and see if I can show that to you. Now that's the memorial that was put up in Washington to those that died of COVID. Each one of those flags represented a body. Absolutely vast. It's one whole mass. Now that was 670,000 flags. They shot 680,000 people. 10,000 more. So, I mean, he was not a Cromwell. He absolutely wasn't a Cromwell. He was a monster. He was a monster who had absolutely no compassion for anyone, even those of his own circle, of his own family. The the numbers of his own close circle, who he either had sent to prison camps or committed suicide or he had poisoned. There's the majority of them, everyone around him.
So let's give the defense of Stalin. I mean, I'm sort of slightly embarrassed to do so, but this is what some people today still claim. So I'm not just making this up, including in Russia, including amongst President Putin's supporters. He used the Red Army to destroy and crush fascism, which was an evil regime which was murdering millions of people in Eastern Europe and particularly the Jewish population. So just for that achievement alone, everything else, we can kind of forget perhaps or forgive because he was the man who destroyed Adolf Hitler and his regime.
Okay. And to an extent, that's true. And the 20 million or so who died partly died because of the ruthless behavior of his generals. He used to shoot his generals that didn't succeed too much, so they just throw bodies at German lines. But let's go back to just the years before the war, because in 1931, the Soviet Union and Germany made a pact, and the pact was one of peace with lots of secret clauses in which they agreed how they were going to divide up Eastern Europe. They were going to split Poland halfway down the middle. As a result of that, Hitler felt free to invade Poland, which he did shortly afterwards, and then declare war on the West. And for the following 2 years, Russia provided millions of tons of war material, steel, precious metals, or the kind of metals you need for hardening steel, grain, and oil in order to support the Nazi war effort and defeat the Allied blockade of German ports. That is overlooked, always overlooked. And war finally broke out and they finally fought back only when the Germans invaded. Stalin was warned by Western leaders. People came over, the sympathetic German communists in the army came over the border and warned. Stalin ordered them to be shot. He said he didn't believe any of these things. He thought it was all the West trying to divide him and Nazi Germany. So that was the beginning. World War II might, I only say might, we never know the answers to history. World War II might not have broken out if he didn't do that. And then the results, obviously, were the complete decimation of Poland, which continued, with the Poles and everything else, 20,000 Polish officers captured in the months after 1939. All the leaders of society, actually, officers, lawyers, policemen, teachers, everything taken off and eventually all shot. So, yes, there is an argument to say the Red Army was responsible for the defeat of Nazi Germany. And to an extent, it certainly made a very, very significant contribution. But when the story is also told at vast cost, the vast cost was partly he'd already shot about 30,000 of his officer corps in 1937 because he feared that they were German spies. And even during the war, Russian military authorities shot 157,000 of their own servicemen and women for military crimes. The numbers shot for crimes by the Allied armies are totally minuscule. You can count them on a couple of hands, I think. I can't remember offhand. So, yes, it is part of the story, most certainly. And it would be wrong to say, oh, no, we in the West won the war. It was a joint effort. Most certainly it was a joint effort. It was a joint effort with enormous sacrifice on Russia's side. And one of the reasons why we didn't have quite the same casualty rate was because British generals and American generals did not use their troops so wantonly, without so much regard for their lives, as the Soviets did. And that was a big difference. And of course, that contributed to the Soviet military success. But also at the same time, it was the devastating cost, devastating, 20 million. And and absolutely catastrophic for the country. That's certainly true.
It's the old steel, not flesh argument that the Allies were investing more in the kind of military technology in bombing and things like that and artillery rather than infantry. And as you say, the Russians, the Red Army, were quite happy to send in their own men to be slaughtered in what's called a kind of meat grinder. And these kind of tactics, perhaps we're still seeing today in Ukraine, where Russia sends over,
Very good parallel.
yeah, they're sending over these kind of hordes of men into Ukrainian lines to try and find weaknesses and basically slaughter their own men. Again, I want to bring back to the Second World War, though. Stay on the Second World War for now. We can perhaps talk about Ukraine in a minute. Do you think that there is a moral comparison between Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler? Do you think that they are on an equal level? Do you think one is more evil than the other? Is there a debate to be had there?
It is certainly a subject that's brought up, and there are books written about the subject. I think there are very good reasons to make parallels. Both leaders offered their country a vision of a new, bright future, of a recreated humanity, if you like. For Hitler, it was the glories of the Aryan Empire, which he was building, the Thousand-Year Reich. And for Stalin, following Marx's dictum, it was the communist utopia. And so there is a parallel in that. And in the process, both also had a similarity in that they considered human lives to be disposable in the furtherance of the greater glory of their country's future. And that's been a feature of the Soviet Union and Soviet leaders for generations, for decades. So I do think there are parallels there. They also saw that the human cost of what they needed to do, they felt, was immaterial. And it didn't matter how many lives were lost as long as they achieved their end objective. And I mean, they're not the only people. Eric Hobsbawm, the English communist historian, who was much feted in his day, who's dead now, but admired publicly by Tony Blair, made a companion of honor and whatever. He was famously interviewed sometime in the 70s or 80s. And he was asked by the interviewer, if you had known that building communism would have cost all these tens of millions of lives that it has done, would it still have been worthwhile? And he looked at the interviewer and he said, yes, I believe it would. So those mentalities are not just in Nazism and in Soviet communism. They did exist in the British left as well. And the British left is still, in its own way, in a very small way, a minority, but it's still very powerful and very vocal, the extreme left.
Well, there's this incredible clip of Diane Abbott, a famous Labour member of Parliament, from a while ago, I think it was around 2010, where she told Andrew Neil that Mao did more good than harm. And I know we're moving the discussion on to Chairman Mao, who another figure from the 20th century who, again, saw untold millions of people die in his country.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. If you wanted to use the body count through enforced famine as a result of deliberate policy as well, you would have to put Mao ahead of both Hitler and Stalin in terms of the numbers of deaths.
So going back to Russia, do you think that Putin's rehabilitation of Stalin is about being a strong man, is about what they call the Great Patriotic War? Or do you think that does it have anything to do with Stalin's terror and his crimes? Do you think that Putin is, in a way, supporting Stalin's ruthless attitude, supporting his Gulag policy, supporting the famines in Ukraine? Or do you think that this is more about him being a sort of strongman dictator and the Second World War? In other words, is Putin endorsing the evil parts of Stalin, or is he kind of ignoring or willfully ignoring those parts of his legacy?
I think nowadays he's willfully ignoring them or allowing the excuse to rise. Well, he wasn't perfect, but look what he did, and it far outweighs his so-called imperfections. We'd call them evil actions, I think, in the West. But I think Putin needs to be understood for another reason too. One of the other reasons why he is promoting the image of the Soviet Union as a great world power to be rebuilt all over again in the way that Stalin did it, because, as I've said before, that so the nation would be feared by those outside. President Putin may appear to be very strong, having got rid of all opposition in one way or another, either by death or just shutting them down. But he still is there's still aspects of his position which are precarious. He is fabulously wealthy. Uh, some years ago, there was an estimate of his wealth at $50 billion. I've no idea if it's doubled or whatever, but he is fabulously wealthy. He has gathered around him people who are equally amoral, and they have fingers in the pie too. But he also knows that should he ever fall from power, he will lose the ability to be able to control what goes on around the senior political class, and he is quite likely to end up by losing his own wealth. So I would never say you should pity him, but he is stuck. He cannot relinquish power. He cannot step down again. He has to remain dictator for life because there aren't any honest people around him now. There are people who serve him for their own benefit. Anybody who's suspicious of, he's got rid of. And so, he's in a difficult position. So he's got to build this image. He's got to build this image of him as the new czar. He has to carry the people behind him. And because the already shaky Russian economy has been devastated by the Ukraine war and by the hundreds of thousands of Russian deaths, that not only must be kept secret, but people must be propagandized, if you like, to believe any sacrifice is worth rebuilding the great empire. So it's not all plain sailing for him.
One final question, and this is about statues themselves and the kind of place that they hold in our public debate and our view of our history around the world. Obviously, in the last few years, there's been huge controversy over statues in Western countries. In the United States, statues of Confederate leaders have been torn down, melted down, attacked, and in some cases defended by people on both sides of the argument. Southerners might argue that this is part of our history. Thousands or hundreds of thousands of Southern Confederate soldiers died in the Civil War, and we should remember those who died as well as who died on the Union side. In Britain, there's been lots of statue controversies over our own Second World War leaders, but also over colonial leaders. So, for example, Winston Churchill's statue was branded with this vandalism, describing him as a racist. Other statues, Bomber Harris in particular, have been controversial. This was the man who led Britain's carpet bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. But of course, the colonial leaders are even more controversial. Clive of India and other sort of imperial colonial figures have been targeted by some activists and campaigners. And those conservatives, those on the right, have argued, well, listen, whatever the good and bad that these people have done, it's important to remember them and their legacy. What about this argument as applying to statues of Stalin, Lenin, and other Soviet figures, that whatever bad they may have done, it's important to remember their legacy for history and to continue debating and thinking about these people?
Well, first of all, you need to remember what happened when the former Soviet states, the Baltic states, Poland, and others, got their freedom. What they did was tear down the statues of Lenin. And in Russia, you didn't need to wait until the fall of communism. When the true crimes of Stalin were revealed in Khrushchev's so-called secret speech, which was widely distributed in the West, Stalin, street names, statues, pictures, whatever, were destroyed and moved en masse. They moved his body from the tomb in the Red Square on display and put it off display in the wall of the Kremlin. Um, and so, yes, in a way, if they are benign statues, but if they are kept there in order to reinforce the ideology of the regime, there is a reason why they should come down. Now, contrarily, in the UK, you need to remember Orwell again. Whoever controls the past controls the present. And there is a huge cultural fight at the moment on to try and erase every good aspect of Britain's past in order to present it as corrupt, wholly bad, and whatever else. And of course, every nation has its own crimes and sins, which must not be whitewashed. But this is part of a deliberate policy that is being conducted to leave people so demoralized that they will not object to other dogmas that the far left wish to introduce. And as far as the colonial era is concerned, I think the person I would really recommend everyone read for a really clear, objective view on that period is Nigel Biggar, now just recently, now Lord Nigel Biggar. He's written very well about this whole subject, never washing the dirt or sweeping the dirt under the carpet, but nonetheless, still at the same time saying, yeah, not only was it not all bad, there are actually legacies now in those nations for which they are grateful. You might talk about Indian democracy and other things like that, but that's another subject which we won't go into today, and that's his subject, not mine.